You thought Thanksgiving would finally bring warmth, a seat at the table, and a moment to belong. Instead, a message arrived. This year, it's just Melissa's family. In that instant, every memory of being overlooked came rushing back, the gifts you never received, the celebrations you were excluded from, the love that always seemed reserved for someone else. Yet this time, something inside you shifted. Rather than bowing your head, you decided to create a table of your own, one filled with light, laughter, and true family. If stories like this move you, a gentle like and subscribe will ensure you never miss the next chapter of these heartfelt drama stories. You sat on the edge of your bed, the glow of your phone screen still sharp in your eyes. The words replayed in your mind like a broken record. This year, it's just Melissa's family. A single message, so brief and casual, yet it carried the weight of years. You stared at your half-packed suitcase in the corner, your sweater neatly folded, the cranberry chutney sealed in its glass jar. They weren't just things. They were symbols. Proof of how much you tried every year to bring something of yourself to the table. For as long as you could remember, you had done this. You had walked into family gatherings holding dishes prepared with care, smiling even when no one looked your way, laughing softly even when your stories were ignored. You had told yourself that maybe, just maybe, one day things would be different. But that day never came. And now, this message told you with startling clarity it never would. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about belonging. About gathering in warmth, about finding your place at a table that meant home. Yet for you, it had always been a reminder of what was missing. You remembered the year Melissa's seat was decorated with ribbons because she had just been accepted into her dream program, while yours was quietly shifted further down, almost at the edge of the table. You remembered Christmas mornings when the living room sparkled with gifts wrapped in golden paper for her, while yours was a single envelope, polite, minimal, forgettable. You remembered birthdays where the whole house sang her name, while yours passed with a distracted smile and a half-hearted cake. It wasn't the material things that hurt the most. It was the message beneath them. She mattered, you did not. She was celebrated, you were tolerated. Still, despite all that, you showed up. Year after year, you walked into that house with hope clutched tightly in your hands. You thought that if you worked harder, achieved more, kept smiling despite the ache, one day they would finally see you. That day you graduated, you looked around for their pride. Instead, they asked if Melissa was coming to take a photo. When you landed your first real job, they nodded politely, but later toasted to your sister's new apartment. Every step you took, every milestone you reached, it was measured against hers and you were always found lacking. And yet, this year felt different. You thought perhaps they would change. Perhaps the empty spaces of the past had finally left their mark. Perhaps you had proven enough by standing tall on your own. You had even chosen a gift for your mother, something thoughtful, a small gesture to show gratitude. You imagined walking in, seeing her smile, hearing your father's voice soften for once. You imagined being welcomed, not as an afterthought, but as someone who belonged. But then, the message. Cold, short, final. You tried to breathe, but the silence in your room pressed in like heavy walls. You looked at the suitcase again, and suddenly it felt foolish, like a symbol of hope you should have abandoned long ago. But before you could close it, your phone buzzed once more. A cousin's name lit up the screen. The message was simple. We're not invited either. You blinked. Another buzz. Same here. Mom said it's just Melissa's family this year. Then another. And another. Slowly, your screen filled with notifications. 18 voices in total. Cousins, aunts, uncles all crossed off the list, all deemed unnecessary, all pushed aside in the name of perfection. It was like a thread had been pulled, unraveling the picture you thought you knew. You weren't alone in your exile. There were others, each carrying their own story of dismissal. People who remembered laughing with you in the backyard as children, sneaking extra desserts when no one was looking, sharing secrets under blankets. Now, they too had been told they didn't belong. The ache inside you shifted. Yes, you were hurt. Yes, the exclusion cut deep. But something stronger began to take root. This wasn't just about you anymore. This was about all of you. About creating a space where no one would ever again feel the sting of being told they had no place. Your eyes drifted back to the jar of chutney. The ruby red mixture glistened under the soft light, and suddenly it wasn't just food. It was a symbol. A promise. If they had no seat for you, then you would build a new table. If they raised you, you would write a new story. You closed your suitcase not in defeat, but in determination. The sweater, the chutney, the hope they would not go to waste. You picked up your phone, scrolled past the messages of exclusion, and instead opened a new one. A simple line. Come to my place. There will be a seat for you. At first, silence. Then one reply. Then another. Soon, the screen lit up again, not with rejection, but with gratitude. People who had been cast aside found their way back to you. One by one, they said yes. They would come. And just like that, the vision became real. 32 seats, 32 plates, 32 voices gathered not in a house that dismissed them, but in one that welcomed them. A table not built on favoritism or hierarchy, but on something far more precious: true belonging. You stood taller than you had in years. No, you weren't going to Melissa's perfect Thanksgiving. You were creating something far more meaningful. You were creating a memory no one would forget. For the first time, you weren't begging for a place at their table. You were building your own. And in that quiet strength, you found freedom. If this story resonates with you, let it be more than just a moment. Press like and gently subscribe, not for me, but for yourself, to keep walking alongside stories that remind us of courage, dignity, and the power of building your own place. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived colder than you expected, the kind of crisp air that carried both promise and ache. The streets were alive with families bustling, grocery bags cradled in their arms, laughter spilling from doorways. For them, it was a day of tradition, of togetherness. For you, it began with silence. There was no familiar car ride back to your parents' house, no smell of turkey drifting through a doorway you once called home. Instead, there was only your own house, grand and quiet, yet suddenly feeling too vast for one person. You stood by the window, watching the sky grow brighter. Somewhere out there, the perfect table was being set. The silver polished, the candles lit, Melissa seated at the center while your parents hovered proudly nearby. You could almost hear the clinking glasses, the echo of conversations that never included your name. A pang struck deep because despite everything, part of you still longed to be there, to feel that elusive sense of belonging. And it was in that moment you realized the cruelest truth. It wasn't just about being excluded this year. It was about being erased altogether. Your phone buzzed again. A cousin wrote, "They didn't even mention us. It's like we never existed." Another added, "All the years we gave, and now nothing." The messages piled up, each one heavy with disappointment. It was clear now this wasn't a careless oversight. It was deliberate. A choice to shrink the circle until only Melissa's glow remained, leaving the rest of you outside in the cold. You remembered last year, how you had been seated near the far end, barely in view of the photographs they later shared online. Melissa had stood in the center, radiant, while you were blurred in the corner. No one had tagged your name. Even then, you told yourself it was an accident. But today, faced with the reality of being cut out entirely, you understood it had never been accidental. It had always been the plan. The jar of chutney still sat on the counter, untouched. You picked it up, feeling the cool glass against your palm. Something about it broke you open. All the nights you had spent teaching yourself to cook, the hours you dedicated to making something worth sharing, it was never just about the food. It was about love, about extending a hand. And now, holding it, you realized how often that hand had been left hanging in the air. Your chest tightened, and for a moment you thought about leaving the jar there, sealing yourself inside the quiet house, letting the day pass unmarked. But then your phone rang. It wasn't another cousin. It was your grandmother. Her voice trembled as she said, "I can't sit there without you. I won't." In that instant, the dam inside you cracked. You weren't alone. There were others who felt the same sting, others who refused to pretend that exclusion was acceptable. So you began to move. One call became 2, then 5, then 10. Soon, the emptiness of your house shifted into preparation. Tables were pulled together, chairs dragged from every corner, the scent of something warm filling the air as neighbors and friends offered to help. The rooms that had once echoed with silence now buzzed with anticipation. What began as rejection had become a gathering of resilience. But still, the shadow lingered. As you worked, your mind wandered back to your parents' dining room. You pictured the clatter of cutlery, the perfect turkey at the center, the way your mother would smile at Melissa, as though no one else existed. That image hurt, sharper than you wanted to admit. Because no matter how strong you tried to be, part of you still wanted her approval, still wished that for once her eyes would light up at the sight of you. When the first guests arrived, their smiles carried both relief and sadness. They stepped inside your home, some with dishes, others with nothing but open hands, and you welcomed them all the same. One cousin whispered, "I thought I'd spend today alone." Another added, "I didn't know where else to go." And in those voices, you found your answer. The table you were building wasn't just an alternative. It was a salvation. Still, as the hours passed, a weight pressed on your heart. You imagined your parents glancing at the empty chairs, realizing the absence of so many faces. You wondered if they felt any regret, or if they believed their celebration was somehow more perfect without you. Perhaps they laughed louder, believing silence from you meant acceptance. Perhaps they thought you were too weak to rise. And that was the moment clarity came. They had written you out, but you were writing yourself in. They had closed their doors, but you had opened yours wider. They had said you were nothing without their table, but you were showing everyone, including yourself, that you were capable of creating something stronger. The laughter grew louder in your home, a sound so different from the hollow echoes of past years. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished, it wasn't staged for photographs. It was real. It was alive. For the first time, you looked around and thought, this is what family should feel like. And in that truth, a quiet peace settled in you. Yes, the pain was still there, but it no longer defined you. You weren't the forgotten child anymore. You weren't the shadow to Melissa's light. You were the heart of a table that stretched wide enough to hold every person who had been told they didn't matter. As the candles flickered and stories flowed, you realized something else too. Your story was no longer one of silence. It was one of resilience. And though you never sought revenge, the most profound answer to their rejection was this: the undeniable warmth filling every corner of your home. If someone watching your story tonight has ever felt unseen, if they've ever carried the ache of being pushed aside, let them know through your choice that dignity can be reclaimed. And as you hold on to this truth, if you feel the pull to walk with these stories a little longer, gently pressing like and subscribe isn't just about a button, it's about keeping alive the reminder that even when others close doors, you have the power to open new ones. Because in the end, what matters most is not the seat you were denied, but the table you built with your own hands. And that, more than anything, is the story worth remembering. The house grew warmer as the day unfolded. What began as an echoing silence now carried the hum of voices, the clatter of dishes, and the steady rhythm of footsteps moving from room to room. Each guest who walked through your door carried not just food or laughter, but a story of their own, a weight they had been forced to hold in silence. And in coming together, those weights began to lift. The long tables you had arranged were imperfect, mismatched chairs pulled from every corner, place settings that didn't match, candles of uneven height. Yet as the light from those candles flickered against the faces gathered around, you realized how little perfection mattered. What mattered was presence. What mattered was that every seat was filled, not by obligation but by choice. Your grandmother was the first to speak, her voice quiet but steady. "This Flo's quote," she said, looking around, "feels more like Thanksgiving than anything I've felt in years." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire room stilled. You saw tears shimmer in her eyes, and you understood that her presence at your table was not just about support, it was about truth. She had chosen to step away from the stage of perfection to sit in the space of sincerity. As plates were passed and glasses filled, laughter began to rise. At first tentative, then freer, until it filled the walls with a sound you had longed to hear your whole life. Cousins leaned in to share stories that had been tucked away, uncles chuckled at jokes that once would have been ignored, and children ran under the tables, their carefree joy weaving through the room like a thread of light. For the first time, you didn't feel like a shadow. You felt like the center, not because of attention, but because of connection. You looked at each face and realized you were no longer standing at the margins of someone else's story. You were part of something new, something whole, something that existed because you chose to make it real. Yet, beneath the laughter, a pang lingered. You thought of your parents' house, only miles away, where the table was likely set in perfect symmetry, Melissa at its heart. You imagined the glow of the chandelier, the crispness of linen napkins, the pride in your mother's eyes, as she poured another glass of wine for Melissa's husband. The image hurt, but less than before. Because now, you weren't outside looking in, you were inside something of your own. Still, the contrast struck you. On one table, perfection without love. On yours, imperfection full of warmth. And that difference became the quiet fire that fueled you through the day. As the evening settled, a storm gathered outside. Rain pattered against the windows, and then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. Gasps filled the room, but before fear could take hold, someone lit a candle, then another, until the tables glowed in a soft golden light. Darkness no longer felt like absence. It felt like intimacy. The song faded, replaced by silence heavy with meaning. You looked around and saw faces glowing with tears, with smiles, with the quiet strength of people who had chosen each other. It struck you then. This was the true turning point. This was the moment you had stopped waiting for belonging and had created it instead. The storm outside raged, but inside, warmth held steady. And as the night went on, you realized how much had shifted. No longer were you the one overlooked, the one pushed aside. You were the host of a new beginning, the builder of a table where every person mattered. Later, when the meal ended and the last plates were stacked, no one rushed to leave. People lingered, sitting in the glow of candles, speaking softly, unwilling to break the spell of togetherness. Some whispered gratitude, others simply placed a hand on yours in quiet thanks. Each gesture reminded you that what you had created wasn't temporary. It was a seed planted in the hearts of everyone present. And though you knew tomorrow might bring calls from your parents, explanations rehearsed and excuses offered, it no longer mattered. Because today, you had proven to yourself that that table did not define your worth. You had proven that you could create something far greater than what you were denied. The bycatch, the cruel exclusion that once threatened to crush you, had instead become a turning point of your story. What was meant to break you had become a moment you finally stood tall. And as you sat among the soft candlelight, surrounded by laughter and love, you felt the quiet triumph of someone who had turned pain into power. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a declaration shouted into the night. It was simply the stillness of knowing, at last, that you belonged. When the last notes of the song faded and the storm outside eased, a gentle quiet settled over your home. Candles still burned, their flames steady despite the rain that tapped softly against the windows. The meal had ended hours ago, but no one moved to leave. Instead, people lingered in the golden glow, reluctant to break apart what had been built that day. You sat among them, your heart carrying a strange duality, both heavy and light. Heavy, because the wound of exclusion still lived within you, a scar carved not just into memory, but into identity itself. Every word your parents had once spoken, every decision they had made to erase your efforts, remained etched deep, refusing to fully fade. But light, because for the first time in years, you had discovered something greater than that wound. You had witnessed a truth larger, warmer, more enduring. You were not alone, and your worth had never depended on their approval. Your grandmother leaned closer, her frail hand resting gently on yours, her touch trembling yet steady enough to anchor you in that moment. "I haven't felt this kind of peace in years," she whispered, her voice like the fragile rustle of old pages. And when you looked into her eyes, you saw more than gratitude. You saw recognition. She knew the ache of being pushed aside, the sting of silence, the slow erosion of self-worth. She too had lived through seasons of invisibility, where her voice carried little weight in the house she once helped hold together. Yet here, at your table, she had found a warmth she thought was lost forever. The room around you hummed with gentle life. Cousins sat close, laughter spilling like candlelight into the corners. Their conversations drifted into stories of childhood, unpolished, unscripted, almost forgotten. One cousin recalled the summer evenings spent climbing trees in the old backyard, branches scratching against knees, the thrill of reaching higher than they were allowed. Another remembered late-night games of cards, played under blankets with a single flashlight, laughter muffled so parents wouldn't hear. These weren't grand memories designed for display, not the kind framed in family albums with everyone in matching outfits and rehearsed smiles. They were messy, imperfect, real, and they were yours. Listening, you realized how much had been buried under years of favoritism and pretense. How many shared histories had been overshadowed by a single narrative that always centered someone else. And yet tonight, like treasures unearthed after being hidden too long, those memories resurfaced. They shimmered not because they were flawless, but because they were true. For years, gatherings at your parents' house had been marked by formality. Everything had to look right, sound right, feel right. The table was always perfectly set, the dishes aligned as if measured by a ruler, the silverware gleaming as though it carried the family's reputation on its surface. Conversations followed invisible scripts, polite, restrained, careful not to disturb a fragile balance of appearances. Smiles were practiced, polished until they no longer carried warmth. Every detail reinforced the unspoken truth. Belonging there was conditional. But here, in your home, the atmosphere was entirely different. The tablecloths didn't match, a patchwork of old and new that spoke of practicality rather than performance. The dishes were uneven, some chipped, some borrowed, but all carrying stories of their own. The chairs wobbled slightly under the weight of laughter and movement, as if they too had learned to bend rather than break. Nothing was staged, nothing rehearsed. And yet, in that imperfection, there was a beauty you had never known before, a beauty that didn't ask for approval, that didn't measure itself against an impossible standard. As the night deepened, something within you began to shift. The image of your parents' table still existed in your mind, but it no longer held the same power. Where once you had longed to be seen there, to be acknowledged in the place they called home, you now saw the emptiness of that desire. What good was a seat at a table where love was rationed like currency, where worth was weighed against another's success? Here, in contrast, your table brimmed with something richer. Acceptance. No one had to earn their place, no one had to compete for approval. Everyone belonged simply because they were present, because their stories, their laughter, their flaws mattered in equal measure. You thought of Melissa then not with anger, but with clarity. For so long, her presence had been the axis around which your family turned, her successes the standard against which everyone else was measured. Her world was built on applause, on being placed at the center of attention. And for years, you had believed that center was the place to be, the only place where value could be found. But now, you no longer envied that spotlight. Because here, at your own imperfect table, you had learned something Melissa never had. That the truest center wasn't applause, it was connection. It wasn't about being chosen as the favorite, but about choosing each other, over and over again, without condition. The longer the night stretched, the more the room seemed to glow. It wasn't just the candles flickering on the table, or the low hum of conversation, it was something deeper, something you felt in your bones. This was what family could be when stripped of pretense. Not a hierarchy of favorites and forgotten, but a circle where everyone carried equal weight. At one point, your grandmother told a story you had never heard before about the early days of her marriage, the sacrifices she had made quietly, the times she had swallowed her own dreams so others could shine. Her voice didn't tremble with bitterness, but with honesty. And as she spoke, you realized she had been waiting decades for a space like this, where her truth could sit at the table without being dismissed. Your cousins leaned in, listening not out of duty, but out of genuine curiosity, and suddenly, you felt a thread weaving between all of you. A thread spun not from the old narratives of who succeeded and who failed, but from the raw fabric of shared humanity. In that moment, you weren't just rebuilding relationships, you were reclaiming an inheritance that had always been yours, hidden beneath layers of silence. The laughter grew softer as the night wore on, giving way to a comfortable stillness. The kind of silence that doesn't demand filling, but simply allows presence. And within that quiet, you felt the wound of exclusion begin to loosen its grip. It didn't vanish, didn't erase itself from history, but it no longer defined you. Instead, you carried something new. The knowledge that you were capable of building a different kind of legacy. One not rooted in comparison, but in community. One not sustained by performance, but by authenticity. You saw it in your grandmother's eyes, in the relaxed shoulders of your cousins, in the way the mismatched chairs seemed to hold everyone just fine. And so, as the night drew toward its close, you allowed yourself a long breath. For the first time, it wasn't a sigh of longing or resignation, it was release. The table at your parents' house could remain as it was, frozen in its perfection, guarded by conditions. It no longer held you captive. Because here, at your own table, you had discovered something far greater. A love that didn't need to be earned, a belonging that didn't need to be proven, and a truth that could never again be erased. At some point, you rose quietly from your chair and began to walk through the rooms of your house. Each step carried a weight that was both grounding and liberating. You had walked through these halls countless times before, but never had they appeared like this. Tonight, they were alive in a way you had never known. Jackets draped casually over chairs, as if claiming their place with confidence. Children lay curled up in corners with blankets, whispering secrets or dozing off with gentle smiles. Laughter spilled through the rooms, weaving itself into the air like music that had no beginning and no end. The house, which only that morning had seemed still and echoing, had transformed before your very eyes. It was no longer a structure of walls and windows, but a living, breathing place, pulsing with the rhythm of belonging. You paused in the doorway of the dining room, letting the scene before you sink into your bones. Your cousins, once hesitant in their movements, now moved with ease, clearing dishes and wiping tables without being asked. The laughter overlapped in a harmony that only came when people felt safe to be themselves. Your grandmother sat in the center of the room, her frail voice carrying stories to the younger ones gathered around her feet, their eyes wide, as if each word she spoke was a secret treasure unearthed from the past. Your uncles leaned back in their chairs, their faces softened by contentment, the kind that came not from perfection but from peace. It struck you then the transformation you were witnessing wasn't confined to the house itself. It was within you. For so long, you had been the person waiting desperately for recognition, stretching yourself thin to be noticed, bending into shapes that never quite fit. But now, without ceremony, you had stepped into your own power. Not through defiance, not through loud confrontation, but through creation. You had built something different, something honest. And in doing so, you had proven first to yourself, and then to everyone around you that love could exist outside the rigid walls of favoritism. Outside, the storm that had rattled windows earlier in the evening had passed completely. The world beyond the glass looked washed clean, as though every tree, every rooftop, every blade of grass had been renewed. Drops of water clung to branches like jewels, reflecting the faint glow of streetlights. Inside, the flicker of candlelight played softly against the walls, steady yet tender, mirroring the calm that had finally settled inside your heart. One by one, people began to gather their things. Coats were pulled over shoulders, scarves were looped loosely around necks. But there was no rush, no urgency. Instead, there was a kind of lingering hugs that lasted longer than usual, words of gratitude spoken with sincerity. Some kissed your cheek and thanked you, not just for the meal, but for the feeling you had given them. The sense of being welcomed, remembered, held. And yet, none of the farewells carried the weight of finality. No one said goodbye as though this were the end. They spoke instead of next year, of new traditions that had been born tonight, of promises to return, and to bring others with them. What had begun as a single act of resilience, your choice to host, to gather, to offer a space, had blossomed into something that would outlive the evening. It had become the beginning of a legacy. When the last guest finally stepped into the night and the door closed behind them, you found yourself standing in quiet once more. But it was not the same quiet that had haunted the house before they came. This silence was warm, like embers after a fire. It was filled with echoes of laughter that seemed to linger in the very walls, in the wood of the tables, even in the air you breathed. You turned slowly, taking in the sight of half-empty glasses, plates still smudged with crumbs, candle stubs melted into soft pools of wax. The clutter felt sacred somehow, a visible reminder that life had truly happened here. For the first time in years, you smiled without hesitation, without a shadow of doubt tugging at the edges. The bycatch that had once defined you, the exclusion, the endless comparisons, the moments of dismissal had not vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer a chain binding you to the past, but soil in which new roots had taken hold. You understood now that pain, while sharp and unwelcome, could also be fertile ground. From it, strength could rise, belonging could bloom, dignity could return. What had been intended to diminish you had instead deepened you, made you capable of building something stronger and more enduring than the hollow approval you once craved. You knew, almost instinctively, that your parents would call eventually. Perhaps they already had. Perhaps even now their voices were waiting on your phone, wrapped in missed calls and unanswered messages. You could imagine the tone may be firm, filled with justifications, explanations designed to patch over old wounds. Or perhaps softer, tinged with regret, with questions about why you hadn't answered. In another time, the very thought would have made your chest tighten, your stomach twist with guilt or longing. But standing there now, you no longer felt that pull. It wasn't that you no longer cared. Caring had always been part of who you were, stitched into your very nature. But what had changed was the need. You no longer needed their validation to define your worth. You no longer needed to sit at that table to believe you belonged. What you had built tonight proved more than their approval ever could. That love did not require permission, that family could be reimagined, and that your voice, once silenced, now rang clear. You walked slowly back to the table, placing a hand on the back of one of the wobbly chairs, feeling its steadiness despite its imperfection. You thought about how fragile it looked, and yet how firmly it had carried the laughter of the evening. In that moment, it became a symbol for everything you had discovered. Life didn't need to be flawless to be beautiful. Belonging didn't need to be earned to be real. The silence around you grew deeper, but instead of pressing down on you, it lifted. You knew the coming days would not be without challenges. Old wounds had a way of resurfacing, and family patterns did not dissolve overnight. But tonight had proven that even the heaviest histories could be rewritten, not by force, but by choosing differently. By opening your door when others closed theirs. By setting a table where no one had to ask for a place. You glanced at your phone resting on the counter. The screen was dark, though you knew with certainty that behind it were messages waiting. You let it stay there. Not out of defiance, but out of peace. For the first time, you didn't need to answer in order to feel whole. You had already answered the deeper question, the one that had haunted you for years. Am I enough? And tonight, surrounded by echoes of connection, the answer was yes. In that moment, you understood what true change meant. It wasn't about turning bitterness into triumph. It wasn't about proving them wrong with grand gestures. It was about finding peace within yourself, about discovering that home was never a place you had to be invited to, it was something you carried, something you created. The clock ticked past midnight. Thanksgiving had ended, but for you, it felt like a beginning. A beginning not tied to your parents' approval or Melissa's shadow, but to the quiet certainty that you had built something enduring. You had built a table that no one could take away. And as you blew out the last candle, watching the smoke curl into the air, you whispered to yourself not a vow of revenge, not a cry of sorrow, but a simple truth. I belong. As the last wisp of candle smoke faded into the air, you stood in the stillness of your home and realized that the silence felt different now. It no longer echoed with loneliness. It carried the soft afterglow of laughter, stories, and voices that had filled every corner. What began as rejection had turned into belonging, and what once felt like loss had become a gift, an awakening to the truth that family is not always defined by blood, but by those who choose to stand beside you. You knew the pain of exclusion would always remain a part of your story, but it no longer had the power